the scandalous reign of Edward VIII, the shaping of a shadowed heir. Edward VIII's early life and legacy in waiting. Beneath the gilded twilight of a waning empire, a child was born into destiny, cloaked not merely in silk and titles, but in the quiet, unseen weight of expectation. It was the 23rd of June, 1894, when the world first knew the infant who would one day become Edward VIII. Though to those closest to him, he would always be David. Born at White Lodge in Richmond Park, Surrey, his arrival marked not just the birth of a royal heir, but the continuation of a lineage already steeped in the complex legacies of power, duty, and restrained affection. His father, George, then Duke of York, was the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, who was himself the eldest child of the formidable Queen Victoria. By the time young Edward came into the world, Victoria was deep into her 7th decade, and it was evident that her son would soon become king, making the newborn David second in line to the throne from his earliest breath. His mother, Mary of Teck, descended from German nobility, carried a quiet dignity that matched the solemn grandeur of her husband's lineage. Together, George and Mary produced 6 children, but it was Edward, their firstborn, who was chosen by fate and formality to one day wear the crown. Yet, as history would later reveal, it was not the crown that defined Edward, but his hesitations, rebellions, and deep yearning for a life of his own making. From his earliest days, Edward's life was charted with the precision of a royal ceremony. His education, conduct, and even emotional expressions were sculpted by the shadowy presence of monarchy. The household in which he grew up was emotionally austere. Though not cruel, his parents adhered to the protocols of royal detachment. Edward himself recalled in later writings a childhood laced with loneliness, shaped by a father whose temper could flare over trifles, and a mother whose love was formal, often filtered through the lens of expectation rather than warmth. While the public might have envisioned a charmed upbringing filled with privilege, Edward's private world was governed by rigid schedules, distant parents, and the unrelenting awareness of duty. The early emotional austerity etched into him a sense of isolation that would later manifest in his adult resistance to the very institution he was born to embody. Notably, Edward's younger brother, Albert, known to the world later as King George VI, would grow into a figure of steadier temperament and deeper resilience, a contrast that would become historically significant as events unfolded. Despite being the firstborn and the nominal favorite of fate, Edward's childhood foreshadowed a man more drawn to personal freedom than to regal constraint. His string of middle names, Edward Albert Christian, George Andrew Patrick David, reflected a monarchy's yearning for symbolic continuity, yet within this grand naming lay the seeds of an inner fracture, a boy burdened with heritage, but craving escape. His youthful persona, charming yet evasive, would mature into the complex figure who later captivated and scandalized the world. These formative years, though draped in the formality of kingship, were at their core a quiet rebellion in gestation. Edward would never father children of his own, a decision perhaps born not of fate, but of a childhood that had offered little warmth to replicate. In his reluctance to embrace the conventional duties of the monarchy and his eventual abdication for love, we find not just the story of a king who walked away, but of a boy who never felt truly at home in the palace of his birth. 1. An heir in the making, charm, constraint, and a crown on the horizon. In a world where privilege veiled pressure and titles disguised the weight of destiny, the boy who would one day be King Edward VIII emerged not just as a figurehead of empire, but as a portrait of charm, delicately masking an unprepared soul. From a young age, Edward captivated those around him with an effortless charisma, an instinctive ease that allowed him to traverse social boundaries more fluidly than most royals of his generation. This natural grace, a trait that set him apart, earned him admiration from all corners of society, from aristocrats to commoners alike. Yet beneath this glowing exterior lay a curious paradox. While the world saw a bright young prince destined for greatness, his intellectual foundation remained notably thin. Unlike the rigorous classical education provided to earlier generations of monarchs, Edward's formative learning took place primarily at home, in the somewhat insular confines of York Cottage at Sandringham and later at Frogmore near Windsor. His upbringing, though steeped in royal tradition, lacked the broader scholastic depth that might have shaped a more expansive worldview. As adolescence approached, he was enrolled at the Naval College at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, echoing the path once taken by his father. There, he faced the realities of a disciplined life, one where hierarchy reigned and bullying was not uncommon, even for a future king. But despite this exposure to structured environments, the intellectual and emotional growth needed to fully prepare him for kingship remained underdeveloped. This became increasingly evident when, at the age of just 15, a pivotal moment arrived: the death of his grandfather, Edward VII, in May 1910. With that passing, Edward's father ascended the throne as George V, and young Edward was thrust formally into the role of heir apparent. Yet, for all the ceremony and symbolism, it was clear even then that the education of this charming yet intellectually unfortified prince had not truly equipped him for the monumental responsibilities that lay ahead. 2. A prince on the edge of empire and war. As the delicate machinery of empire turned around him, the young Edward, newly adorned with the title of Prince of Wales, was quietly ushered into the luminous yet burdened stage of public life. Still in his teenage years, he was expected to embody centuries of royal precedent, standing at ceremonies, shaking hands, and appearing ever poised beneath the weight of a crown not yet his. His father, King George V, determined that Edward should follow the academic path of elite tradition and thus sent him to the University of Oxford, hoping the hallowed halls might instill a seriousness of purpose. But Edward's natural disposition resisted scholarly rigor, and he drifted through his studies with indifference, the call of intellectual discipline paling against the appeal of society and freedom. It was in this restless state that the world around him began to fracture, and for Edward, the approaching thunder of war in the summer of 1914 was less a tragedy than a welcome escape from the stifling duties of books and protocol. The war that erupted had its roots in decades of geopolitical tension, sparked by the rise of a unified Germany, the scramble for colonial dominance, and the roiling nationalism in Eastern Europe, especially in the Balkans, where great empires vied for influence over the decaying Ottoman domains. A regional crisis quickly ignited a global inferno, and as the old world began to collapse under the weight of its alliances and ambitions, Edward stood at the threshold of a new era. No longer a boy, not yet a leader, but a prince suspended between the remnants of Victorian grandeur and the chaos of a century in flames. 3. Winds of war and a prince in uniform, Edward and the First World War. As Europe trembled beneath the gathering storm of empires and resentments long left to simmer. A single bullet fired in Sarajevo in the summer of 1914 would unleash a cataclysm that would redraw borders, bury millions, and irrevocably alter the course of monarchies. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, by a Serb nationalist did not merely end a life. It shattered a fragile diplomatic balance, dragging the great powers into a conflict that had been gestating for decades. Within weeks, Britain stood locked in battle alongside France and Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary, and the world was plunged into the mechanized inferno of what would soon be called the First World War. For Prince Edward, recently bestowed with the title Prince of Wales, the war offered a form of meaning that Oxford never had. His academic indifference faded quickly amid the structured solidarity of military life, and in July 1914, he was commissioned into the Grenadier Guards. Though surrounded by safeguards that prevented him from seeing true frontline combat, Edward found in the army a rhythm of life that satisfied a longing for purpose, for identity beyond duty, born of blood. He was not a soldier in the trenches, but he was no idle figure either. Though his roles were largely ceremonial or diplomatic, inspecting army camps, meeting French commanders, traveling to boost troop morale, his presence had genuine impact. Soldiers who saw him felt the living symbol of the monarchy walking among them, and in a war of attrition and despair, that gesture held weight. On more than one occasion, Edward was close to real danger, including the death of his chauffeur when artillery struck near his vehicle in northern France. His involvement extended beyond the Western Front, as he undertook a visit to the Middle East in 1916 to meet with Australian and New Zealand troops, adding further to his public image as a royal who shared in the wartime sacrifice, however distantly. But the war did not just reshape Edward's sense of self, it also reshaped the identity of the institution he was born into. At the war's outset, the royal family bore the name House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a title inherited from Edward's grandfather, King Edward VII, upon his accession in 1901. Though this name acknowledged familial ties to the great houses of Germany, those links became increasingly uncomfortable as the war dragged on. By 1917, German bombers, ironically bearing the name Gotha, rained destruction upon London, and public anger surged at the visible German roots of Britain's own royal family. Even more damning was the close familial link between George V and Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II. They were first cousins, and the resemblance in their features was not lost on the British public. In response, and in an effort to assert a more distinctly British identity, George V made a profound symbolic decision in July 1917. The royal family would henceforth be known as the House of Windsor. Named after the ancient and beloved Windsor Castle, this rebranding severed the linguistic tether to Germany and replaced it with an image of noble English resilience. Though the war ended in November 1918 with an Allied victory, the psychological transformation it wrought on Edward and the institution of monarchy lingered. For Edward, the new identity of Windsor would follow him through triumph and scandal alike, a name he would carry into a future filled with admiration, controversy, and ultimately, abdication. And for Britain, it marked the beginning of a modern monarchy, reshaped not by conquest, but by survival, perception, and the quiet, enduring power of reinvention. 4. A restless heart and a rising tension. Edward's post-war years and the shadow of the crown. When the guns fell silent in 1918 and the Great War's smoke began to clear, a different kind of pressure settled on Edward, Prince of Wales, not the thunder of battlefields, but the quiet and enduring call of dynastic duty. The question that had long hovered now emerged with sharper urgency. When would the heir to the throne marry and secure the line with legitimate issue? Traditionally, royal marriages were arranged with cold strategy, a fusion of alliances and duty rather than affection. But the world Edward inhabited was changing. King George V, perhaps sensing the emotional cost of such arrangements in his own life, permitted his son a greater degree of freedom in choosing a wife. Simultaneously, public sentiment had shifted. By the 1920s, the British people, weary of war and awakening to modern ideals, increasingly expected that love, not merely lineage, should play some role in the marriage of a future king. Yet Edward, far from feeling urgency, leaned into the exhilarating chaos of the new decade. The trauma of war gave way to the jazz and glitter of post-war London, and Edward found in this world of dance halls, nightclubs, and smoky elegance a seductive alternative to royal formality. Surrounded by an entourage and endlessly photographed as the dashing bachelor prince, he began an affair with Winifred Dudley Ward, a married woman with children and deep roots in the British aristocracy. The affair, though intense and long-lasting, ended without marriage, even after her divorce. Other women came and went in these years, but none would lead Edward down the expected path of matrimony. His lifestyle, full of pleasure but lacking the constraints of duty, increasingly troubled those around him. Behind palace walls and within government halls, whispers turned into warnings. His casual charisma and appetite for the high life were not just seen as youthful indulgence. They signaled a potential volatility in the future king. More than his romantic entanglements, it was Edward's way of being that unsettled Britain's conservative establishment. His tendency to blur the lines between class, his ease with common soldiers during the war, and his friendly, informal manner during royal tours to Canada, the Empire, and beyond, might today be considered assets in a modern royal. But in the rigid, hierarchical world of interwar Britain, these behaviors drew suspicion, not praise. Royals were expected to be dignified, ceremonial, above politics and sentiment. Edward, however, gave the impression of someone who might one day seek to influence political matters or shape the role of monarch according to his own image. Such fears deepened as the 1920s wore on, and King George I's health began to falter. A serious illness between 1928 and 1929 caused alarm across the nation, and though he recovered and continued to reign for several more years, the prospect of Edward's ascension loomed ever closer. And with it came unease, not only among his family, who had long noted his aversion to convention, but among ministers and senior officials who feared that the future king might not respect the delicate constitutional balance that had defined the monarchy since the days of the Hanoverians. By the close of the decade, beneath the veneer of glittering parties and polished charm, a deeper tension had taken root, one that would, in time, erupt into the most dramatic constitutional crisis the British monarchy had faced in generations. 5. A Crown for Love, Edward VIII, Wallis Simpson, and the crisis that changed the monarchy forever. In the shifting haze of the early 1930s, as Europe danced on the edge of another abyss, the man once destined to lead an empire stepped into a relationship that would unravel everything the crown had prepared him for. It was during these unsettled years that Edward, Prince of Wales, met the woman who would alter the course of his life, and in doing so, the destiny of a monarchy. Her name was Bessie Wallace Warfield. born into modest but respectable circumstances in Pennsylvania and raised in Baltimore, where she and her widowed mother were supported by wealthy relatives. Wallis Simpson, as she became known, had weathered the upheavals of two marriages, first to Earl Winfield Spencer Jr., an American naval pilot, a union marked by turbulence and long separations, and later to Ernest Simpson, an Anglo-American businessman whose financial standing faltered after the 1929 crash. By the time she entered Edward's world, she had become a fixture in the upper social circles of London, though her rise was, in part, built on illusion. Ernest Simpson's finances were crumbling beneath the weight of the Great Depression, and Wallis, sharply intelligent and socially ambitious, was navigating a marriage that was unraveling quietly behind closed doors. Into this fragile moment came the future king, whose charm and restless spirit found a strangely magnetic anchor in Wallis's commanding presence. From the beginning, their bond was different, intensely personal, emotionally charged, and strikingly imbalanced. Edward, for all his worldly status, retained a curiously adolescent disposition, emotionally dependent, forever in need of attention and affirmation. Wallis, quick-witted and self-assured, seemed to fulfill a maternal as much as romantic role, and by 1934, he had ended his other romantic entanglements and was wholly enthralled by her. This dynamic, in which Edward appeared subordinate to Wallis's will, unsettled those who observed them closely, but to Edward, her influence was not a threat, it was a lifeline. He came to view her not just as a partner, but as the only person who understood him, and by 1935, he had decided she would be his queen. Yet the path ahead was strewn with obstacles, and some were immovable. Wallis was not only American, but twice divorced, facts which by the strict religious and moral standards of 1930s, Britain made her entirely unsuitable to be queen. The Church of England, of which the king was the nominal head, forbade the remarriage of divorced persons while their former spouses lived. Wallis's previous husband was very much alive, and her pending second divorce only intensified the controversy. Complicating matters further were reports from within British intelligence suggesting that Wallis exerted undue control over Edward, making decisions on his behalf and perhaps even influencing his views on international matters. George V, Edward's father, had harbored deep reservations about the woman and the relationship, assigning surveillance to monitor their movements as early as 1935. When George V died on 20th of January 1936, Edward ascended to the throne as Edward VIII. The public, weary of the long reign of the aging monarch, initially embraced the idea of a younger, modern king. But this optimism was quickly dimmed by Edward's attitude toward governance. He showed little interest in matters of state, often ignoring official documents, preferring instead to maintain his previous lifestyle of leisure, socializing, and travel. At a time when Europe was descending into darkness, such distractions seemed careless, even dangerous. The world around Edward was increasingly unstable. Germany, humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, had turned to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, who seized power in 1933 and began dismantling democratic institutions and rearming the nation. The Soviet Union, born of revolution, had emerged as a major ideological and military threat. Japan had invaded Manchuria and was expanding aggressively across Asia. In Western Europe, fascist regimes were solidifying their grip on Italy, Austria, and Hungary, while Spain teetered on the edge of civil war. Amid all this turbulence, Britain needed a steady hand, a symbol of constitutional continuity. But Edward's attention was fixed elsewhere. on Wallis, Simpson, and the unfolding crisis their love affair had provoked. Initially, the relationship was treated with a veil of silence by the British press, which operated under an informal agreement not to publish details of the king's private life. But foreign newspapers were not so restrained, and stories of the king's Mediterranean yachting holiday with Wallis in early 1936 drew sharp attention. When it became clear that Wallis was finalizing her divorce from Ernest Simpson, alarm spread quickly through the corridors of power. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, though generally indecisive and hesitant to act swiftly, realized he could delay no longer. On 20th October 1936, he met with the king to address the matter directly. Baldwin advised Edward that Wallis should leave the country temporarily and postpone her divorce proceedings until the constitutional implications could be more fully discussed. Edward, dismissing the suggestion, insisted that Wallis's marital status was a private matter and not the concern of government. But behind closed doors, the government had already begun contingency planning. Within a week of that meeting, Wallis had secured her divorce, though legally she would not be free to remarry for another 6 months. As Edward opened Parliament that same month, unaware that his reign was slipping away, Baldwin's government began preparing the Duke of York, Edward's brother Albert, for the possibility of replacing him. By 16th November, Baldwin met Edward again. This time, the king openly declared his intent to marry Wallis once she was legally free to do so. The revelation triggered a constitutional crisis unlike any the modern British monarchy had faced. Baldwin consulted with governments across the Dominions, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and others, all of whom opposed the idea of Wallis as queen. The religious and moral standards of the time, still deeply embedded in national identity, made the union unacceptable. The Church of England would not countenance it. Parliament would not support it. The people, though curious and divided, were not considered ready to accept such a break with tradition. Edward, faced with overwhelming opposition, offered a compromise. He would marry Wallis in a morganatic marriage, one in which she would be his wife but not queen, and their children would not inherit the throne. But this too was rejected, as it would require an act of Parliament and open up dangerous political debates about the monarchy's role. As pressure mounted, Wallis left Britain for France on the 3rd December to avoid further scandal, but it was too late. The press blackout had crumbled, public discussion surged, and Baldwin made it clear that Edward could not remain king if he insisted on marrying Wallis. Edward, unwavering in his devotion, chose love over the crown. On 10th of December 1936, Edward signed the instrument of abdication. The following day, in a solemn radio address, he spoke to the nation with rare dignity and composure, declaring, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." At just 327 days, his was the shortest reign since the 15th century. The speech struck a chord with the public. It was heartfelt, poignant, and briefly redeemed a figure otherwise seen as reckless. Yet that moment of grace would not last. The years that followed revealed a far more controversial side to the former king, now styled the Duke of Windsor. His affinity for Nazi Germany, his political naivete, and his continued resentment toward the royal family would taint the image of a man who had once captivated a nation. But in that singular moment of abdication, Edward had reshaped the monarchy forever. redefining its limits, its vulnerabilities, and its dependence on public morality. His love for Wallis Simpson had cost him the throne, and though their marriage would endure, it would be lived in exile, far from the halls of power he once stood to inherit. The crisis of 1936 left scars on the monarchy, but it also reinforced its core principle, that the crown must always stand above individual desire, bound by tradition, tempered by duty, and shaped, ultimately, by the will of the nation. 6. The price of love, the shadow of power, the Windsors in exile, and the path to infamy. As the curtain fell on Edward VIII's reign and the nation exhaled from the storm of abdication, the lingering question of what role the former monarch would now play loomed like a ghost over the British establishment. On 13th December 1936, just 2 days after Edward signed away the throne and publicly announced his abdication, his brother and new sovereign, King George VI, proposed a new title for Edward and his future wife. They would become the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, cloaking the seismic rupture in the monarchy with the elegance of a ducal title rooted in the still fresh royal name, Windsor, born only in 1917. The gesture was both a concession and a boundary. Alongside this title came generous financial compensation, including a lifetime allowance and the rights to sell his interests in several royal estates, arrangements that ensured a luxurious exile, but at the same time sealed his distance from the royal core. Beneath the polished surface, however, bitterness brewed. Edward's persistent campaign to have Wallis Simpson recognized as Her Royal Highness was met with cold resistance, as senior royals and the British government alike feared the consequences of such a concession. The symbolic power of titles mattered deeply in royal protocol, and to elevate Wallis risked reigniting the constitutional crisis that had nearly fractured the institution. Instead, even after the couple's wedding at the Château de Condé near Tours, France, on 3rd June 1937, a quiet affair, snubbed by the entire royal family, Wallis remained formally and coldly addressed as Mrs. Simpson in private correspondence by members of the royal household well into the 1940s. Exiled from Britain in all but name, Edward and Wallis took refuge in the glamour of Parisian society. They lived in luxury, enjoying the perks of royalty without the responsibility, believing, or perhaps hoping, that their removal from the royal fold was temporary. They entertained aristocrats, journalists, and foreign dignitaries, their apartment and country retreats always alive with visitors. But the messages that trickled from London disabused them of any illusion. Their presence was unwelcome, their return undesirable, and their exile meant to be permanent. With that painful realization, Edward began to recast himself, not as a lost king, but as a figure who might still influence Europe from the margins. In this pursuit, he soon made the gravest misstep of his life, one that would cast an irreparable shadow over his name and that of his wife for generations to come. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in Germany had by then reshaped the geopolitical landscape of Europe. And while many British figures visited Germany in the early years of Nazi rule, drawn by curiosity, diplomacy, or the apparent recovery of the German economy, Edward's 1937 visit was different in scale, symbolism, and consequence. The invitation had been extended in the summer of 1937 by Dr. Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, a Nazi institution created to replace trade unions and prevent worker dissent. Edward, eager to rehabilitate his image and establish a new public role, accepted. His visit to Germany, officially billed as a private tour, began on 11th October 1937. He and Wallis arrived at Berlin's Friedrichstrasse station and were greeted not only by Ley, but also by Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's ambassador to Britain and soon to become its foreign minister. What followed was a 12-day tour orchestrated with near-military precision, designed to impress and to persuade. The Windsors were shown a Germany of glittering industry, ordered workers, clean streets, and tireless productivity. They toured light bulb factories and steel works, academies for German youth, and even a recently constructed concentration camp, though the visit was carefully staged, with its true purpose deliberately concealed from the couple. In each city and stop, the British and German national anthems were played in alternation, subtle propaganda underscoring the narrative that Germany and Britain were cultural cousins, nations that should be aligned, not opposed. It was not merely an illusion of productivity, but of ideological proximity. The Nazis wished to convey that they were the rightful bastion against Bolshevism, and in Edward, they believed they had a sympathetic ear. Throughout the visit, Edward and Wallis were treated not merely as former royalty, but as honored statespeople. Dinners were held in their honor with top Nazi officials. On their first evening in Berlin, they dined at Horscher's, a favored haunt of the regime, in the company of Ribbentrop, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, architect Albert Speer, and their spouses. More telling and more ominous were their meetings with high-ranking Nazis like Hermann Göring, who hosted the Windsors at his lavish hunting estate. There, Edward toured rooms decorated with military maps that openly portrayed a vision of a greater Germany, including Austria, which was still nominally independent. Not only did Edward fail to raise objections, but by all contemporary accounts, he seemed undisturbed by the implications. What further alarmed observers, both then and now, was Edward's visible enthusiasm throughout the tour. He frequently offered the Nazi salute, seen not merely as a protocol breach but as a tacit approval. His presence in armaments factories, where submarines and tanks were in production, combined with his cordial engagements with Nazi officials, suggested to many that he sympathized with the regime's aims. Even more provocative was his private meeting with Adolf Hitler himself, which took place at the Berghof on 22nd October. The precise content of their discussion remains a matter of enduring speculation. No complete record survives. Minutes of the meeting were reportedly destroyed, a fact that continues to fuel theories that something of great consequence was said. Some accounts suggest the encounter was brief, filled with pleasantries, tea, and diplomatic courtesy. Others insist Edward expressed support, or at the very least understanding, of Hitler's territorial ambitions in Austria, Czechoslovakia, and Poland. At minimum, he did not challenge them. What is certain is that the meeting ended with Edward offering Hitler the Nazi salute, captured in photographs that would later haunt the historical record. Even the final evening of their visit stirred suspicion. In Munich, the Windsors were hosted by Rudolf Hess, Hitler's close deputy, and his wife, Ilse. During the evening, Edward and Hess reportedly vanished for over an hour, returning with vague explanations about a model ship collection. An anecdote that would seem almost comic were it not cloaked in the fog of deeper, darker possibility. To this day, historians debate the true extent of Edward's Nazi sympathies. Some argue he was merely naive, a dethroned monarch desperate to feel relevant. Others point to surviving correspondence and witness testimony to suggest that Edward did indeed envision a possible German-British alliance, perhaps even viewing himself as a useful bridge between the two powers. should Britain's constitutional crisis ever bring him back to influence. What is not disputed is that his judgment was catastrophically poor, his visit a gift to Nazi propaganda, and his continued association with the regime a source of deep unease for both the British government and the royal family. The visit did not end Edward's public life, but it forever redefined it. He and Wallis returned to Paris not as misunderstood exiles, but as figures increasingly viewed with suspicion and disdain. The exile they thought might end was now cemented. And while Europe drifted toward the conflagration of the Second World War, Edward's legacy, already fractured by abdication, was being recast in a darker, more dangerous light, one from which neither he nor Wallis would ever fully escape. The ghost of that visit would linger for decades, the silence of destroyed minutes speaking louder than words, a testament to a former king who once chose love over duty, and then chose illusion over history. 7. Whispers in Exile. The Windsors' War and the Unforgivable Alliance. As the echoes of their ill-fated visit to Germany faded and the opulence of Parisian life resumed, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor attempted to settle into the role of elegant exiles, residing in a grand mansion on the Boulevard Suchet in the late 1930s. But the world beyond their polished salons and glittering soirees was unraveling. The illusion of peace that had held the European continent together since the Great War was rapidly dissolving. Already, during Edward and Wallis' 1937 journey to Hitler's Reich, signs of Germany's aggressive ambitions had become unmistakable. Adolf Hitler, determined to unify all ethnic Germans under one rule, was increasing pressure on Austria to merge politically with Berlin. In March 1938, the long-feared Anschluss occurred. Austria was absorbed into Nazi Germany in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles. Just months later, Hitler turned his attention to the Sudetenland, a heavily German-speaking region of western Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, alongside the French, agreed to appease Hitler at the infamous Munich Conference in September 1938, hoping this concession would ensure peace. But the promise of peace for our time quickly proved hollow. By March 1939, German troops overran the rest of Czechoslovakia and seized the Baltic port of Memel. When Hitler invaded Poland on 1 September 1939, the final bluff was called. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and the Second World War had begun. In Paris, Edward and Wallis, like millions across Europe, faced a new and terrifying reality. With Poland quickly overrun and a German assault on France expected imminently, they began making plans for safety, just as Europe entered what became known as the Phony War, a quiet lull with no Western attacks through the winter of 1939 into early 1940. But the illusion would not last. In April 1940, Nazi forces invaded Denmark and swiftly occupied Norway. The full fury of Hitler's war machine was soon unleashed, and within weeks, the Wehrmacht stormed into Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France. As the British Expeditionary Force became trapped at Dunkirk in May, a daring evacuation, Operation Dynamo, rescued over 300,000 Allied troops, but the French were less fortunate. On 14th June 1940, Paris fell to the Nazis. France, once a sanctuary for the Windsors, became the heart of the occupation. Amid this chaos, fresh suspicions emerged regarding Edward's loyalties. British diplomats began whispering that the former king had shared sensitive intelligence with the Germans, information that may have aided their lightning strike through Belgium. The accusation was shocking. A British royal, accused of betraying military secrets, during the most desperate days of war. Whether or not Edward actively leaked information, his next moves would confirm for many that he had become a grave liability. As France collapsed, the Windsors fled south to Biarritz, then crossed the border into Francoist Spain, a nation ideologically aligned with the fascist regimes of Italy and Germany. It was there, in the liminal space between neutrality and collusion, that Nazi intelligence devised Operation Willy, a plot by the SS to kidnap Edward and Wallis, transport them to Germany, and groom Edward for restoration to the British throne in the event of a successful German conquest. The Nazis believed that Edward, known for his sympathies, could serve as a puppet monarch, a familiar face to ease British resistance to occupation. Though Operation Willy was never executed, largely due to logistical challenges and the Windsors' rapid movement into Portugal, it marked the chilling depth of Hitler's interest in manipulating the British monarchy for his own ends. By early July 1940, the Windsors were installed in Lisbon, the capital of neutral Portugal. But the atmosphere surrounding their arrival was anything but reassuring. Instead of laying low or demonstrating solidarity with Britain, Edward and Wallis accepted the hospitality of Ricardo Espírito Santo, a Portuguese banker with strong ties to Berlin, and a man closely watched by British intelligence. MI6 had already opened a file on Santo, suspecting him of acting as a conduit for Nazi messages in Iberia. Whether through ignorance or willful disregard, Edward's decision to stay under Santos' roof seemed to confirm his detachment from Britain's national interests. Worse still, newly uncovered evidence suggests that during their stay, Edward expressed support for a horrifying strategy, encouraging Nazi Germany to bomb Britain into submission. In an effort to avoid a costly invasion, Edward proposed through Espírito Santo that Hitler's Luftwaffe conduct a massive aerial bombing campaign across London and major English cities to force Churchill's government into surrender. This notion, later realized as the Blitz, would rain fire across Britain in the months that followed, killing more than 40,000 civilians between September 1940 and May 1941. That a former British king might have suggested such a course is not only shocking, but has been interpreted by many as treason of the highest order. Although Edward may have believed this was the lesser evil compared to a ground invasion, the moral and political implications were staggering. The former king's behavior had by now become intolerable to Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who viewed Edward's presence in neutral Europe as a ticking bomb. The possibility of him falling into Nazi hands, or worse, willingly collaborating, was too dangerous to ignore. Churchill acted swiftly. Without offering Edward the opportunity to return to Britain, he arranged for him to be appointed governor of the Bahamas, a colonial backwater far removed from the politics of Europe. The message was clear. Exile would continue, but this time under British supervision. On 1st August 1940, Edward and Wallis boarded the steamship Excalibur and departed Lisbon for the Caribbean. But even as they sailed away, Edward left behind one final act that has haunted historians ever since. On 15th August, he sent a telegram to Ricardo Espírito Santo asking him to inform him when it was time to act. The ambiguous wording was seen by some as innocent, perhaps referring to property matters, but for others, it hinted at something far more sinister, a readiness to return to Europe if Germany triumphed over Britain and to reclaim his place, not as governor or nobleman, but once again as king, crowned by the enemy. When this telegram became public in 1957, Edward dismissed its significance. as he had done with so many troubling episodes from his wartime conduct. But the accumulated weight of his actions, his associations, his advocacy of bombing, his refusal to return to Britain, and his dangerous naivety cemented the view that he had abandoned his homeland in its hour of need. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor would live out their lives in relative comfort and increasing isolation, their names whispered with unease whenever the conversation turned to loyalty, monarchy, and betrayal. And though time would soften some public perceptions, the haunting legacy of Edward's wartime behavior remains. An ex-king who cast away duty for desire, and then, in a time of global darkness, stood perilously close to the line where exile becomes enmity. 8. Shadowed in the sunlight, the Windsors in wartime and the lingering ghost of ambition. As the Second World War escalated and nations were drawn deeper into its unforgiving vortex, the shadow of Edward and Wallis lingered like a whisper, too dangerous to ignore. Their past associations with the Nazi regime, their uncanny timing, and the unsettling neutrality of their exile had already caused unease in diplomatic and intelligence circles. When in the spring of 1941, the couple traveled from their post in the Bahamas to visit the United States, those concerns crystallized into active surveillance. At the request of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, placed the Duke and Duchess of Windsor under discreet observation, prompted by intelligence leaks from multiple sources. Chief among these was a German monk living in the U.S. who alleged that Wallis Simpson had previously been romantically involved with Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Nazi ambassador to Britain in 1936 and later foreign minister. Compounding the anxiety was another British informant who claimed that Edward had made a private arrangement with Hermann Göring that, should Germany be victorious, Göring would remove Hitler and place Edward back on the throne of England. Whether these claims were grounded in reality or sprang from the fevered imaginations of informants remains unclear to this day. Yet the fact they were considered credible enough to warrant FBI attention speaks volumes about the degree of mistrust Edward and Wallis had sown. Despite the ambiguity surrounding the truth of these allegations, the mere possibility of betrayal by a former king turned the Windsors into a matter of national security on both sides of the Atlantic. While these suspicions trailed them in the shadows, Edward and Wallis passed the war years largely ensconced in what Edward privately referred to as a third-rate colony, the Bahamas. Appointed governor of the island archipelago in 1940 by Winston Churchill, not as an honor, but as a method of strategic removal from European politics, Edward carried out his duties with thinly veiled resentment. His condescending attitude toward the local population, whom he openly viewed through a racist colonial lens, made him ill-suited for his role, especially when a significant labor riot erupted in Nassau in the summer of 1942. Yet surprisingly, the disgraced former king showed flashes of political tact. He diffused the crisis with a program of limited reforms, introducing modest public works and a policy of poor relief, measures that, while falling far short of justice, at least pacified unrest. Still, neither Edward nor Wallis ever accepted the Bahamas as anything more than a punishment. By March 1945, with the war nearing its end, Edward resigned from his post and began preparing for a return to the European stage, even as their wartime legacy continued to darken. While the Windsors waited out the war under tropical skies, the world was shifting in irreversible ways. Hitler, having failed to conquer Britain in 1940, redirected his attention to the east, launching Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union that would become the largest military operation in history. That winter, the German war machine reached the gates of Moscow and Leningrad, but the Soviet resistance stiffened. By 1942, the Eastern Front devolved into a grinding stalemate, and Germany's fortunes began to shift. With America's entry into the war following the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the tide of global conflict turned more decisively. Allied forces surged. The Soviet Union's inexhaustible manpower bore down on the East, and by the summer of 1943, Germany was in retreat across multiple fronts. In the West, the Allies pushed through Italy, and in June 1944, launched the Normandy landings that opened the Western Front. The final year of the war became a race for Berlin, won by the Soviets, as the Allies occupied Germany from opposite directions. Hitler committed suicide in late April 1945, and by early May, the war in Europe was over. Back in post-war Europe, though the public narrative softened, the suspicions surrounding Edward never fully disappeared. The British press, possibly out of deference or fatigue, avoided publicly indicting him, but unofficial channels made clear that his presence in Britain was still deemed inappropriate. He and Wallis resumed life in Paris, their familiar sanctuary, but a fresh current of ambition stirred once again. King George VI, Edward's younger brother and reluctant successor, had begun suffering severely from health issues, compounded by heavy smoking and the immense stress of war leadership. Sensing an opportunity, Edward initiated a quiet campaign through letters and intermediaries, proposing a return to Britain not merely as a private citizen, but potentially as a regent to guide the young Princess Elizabeth, his niece. In these private correspondences, Edward cast doubt on the influence of the Mountbatten family, relatives of Elizabeth's future husband, Prince Philip, suggesting that only he could protect the monarchy from their ambitions. But his proposition was met with silence. His family remembered too well the damage done, and the notion of reintroducing him into British public life was dismissed as fantasy. George VI recovered from his wartime health crises and continued to reign until 1952. By the time of his death, Elizabeth was well into adulthood and ready to assume the throne in her own right. When Queen Elizabeth II was crowned in 1953, Edward did not return to witness the moment his line had once been destined to shape. Instead, he watched the coronation from his home in Paris on television. No longer a king, no longer a threat, just a name forever shadowed by what might have been. His restless pursuit of relevance had failed, his wartime legacy tainted, and though he lived in comfort and with ceremony, it was always on the margins of history. His exile had not been merely physical, but spiritual, a descent from sovereign to footnote, one whose story, for all its grandeur and scandal, remained a cautionary tale about the corrosive pull of personal desire over public duty. 9. A quiet eclipse. The final years of Edward and Wallis. After the long storm of abdication, scandal, wartime suspicion, and political estrangement, it seemed that the final act of Edward and Wallis's extraordinary story would settle into an unexpected calm. With Queen Elizabeth II's accession in 1952, the former King Edward VIII and his wife, Wallis Simpson, appeared to relinquish any lingering aspirations of influence or return. From their Parisian retreat, they became a peculiar relic of the interwar age, a couple whose fame was as controversial as it was enduring, suspended forever in the moment when love clashed with the crown. In Paris, they embraced a curious kind of celebrity, mingling with aristocrats, artists, and British expatriates. Though they had long since been cast out from the royal inner circle, their story continued to captivate, transforming them into elegant outsiders of history, dining in cafes, lounging in salons, always trailed by the mythology of what might have been. Edward's wealth remained substantial, drawn from financial arrangements granted after his abdication, but he also supplemented his income through less scrupulous methods, most notably illegal currency trading. And in a move that shocked royal traditionalists, he became the first English king since 1688 to publish a memoir. A King's Story, released in 1951, was both a personal narrative and a political statement, offering critiques of post-war liberalism and a reflection on his abdication. His tone defensive, wistful, occasionally bitter, but undeniably significant as a window into a monarch who never truly reconciled with his fall. By the mid-1950s, Edward and Wallis had become frequent visitors to the United States, indulging in its celebrity culture and enjoying access to the upper echelons of politics and society, even visiting President Dwight D. Eisenhower at the White House. In the media, they were described not merely as former royals, but as transatlantic curiosities, famed not for power, but for defiance, symbols of a love story that had changed the shape of monarchy itself. Yet behind the glamour, their relationship remained a puzzle. Many who encountered them in these years remarked on their emotional distance. They rarely addressed each other directly, often moving through social occasions as if bound by duty more than affection, a haunting contrast to the fierce romance that had once upended the British throne. In the mid-1960s, they returned briefly to England, their reappearance notable for its ceremonial restraint. They attended several royal functions, including the funeral of Princess Marina of Kent, a sister-in-law to Edward, and though their presence was accepted, it was never fully embraced. By then, Edward was deep into his 70s, his body deteriorating under the cumulative toll of a lifetime of heavy smoking. To manage his health, he frequently traveled to the United States for medical treatments, undergoing various surgeries aimed at relieving his growing coronary complications. Inevitably, the damage could not be undone. In the early 1970s, Edward was diagnosed with throat cancer. The disease was advanced and terminal. As the former king withdrew into quiet seclusion in his Paris home, there was at least one final reconciliation of sorts. Queen Elizabeth II, on a state visit to France in 1972, made time to see her uncle, a meeting both poignant and symbolic, bridging a decades-long rift that had cast Edward to the periphery of royal life. On 28 May 1972, Edward died in Paris. In death, he was briefly returned to the heart of the monarchy. His body was transported to England and lay in state at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, not Westminster Hall, as was customary for monarchs, but still within the sacred grounds of the royal family's ancestral seat. To the surprise of many, the British public turned out in large numbers to pay their respects to the man who had once reigned for only 327 days. The funeral on 5th June was attended by Queen Elizabeth II, the royal family, and Wallis, who stood beside the grave of the man for whom she had once cost an empire. He was interred at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, a resting place he had once doubted would be afforded to him. After Edward's passing, Wallis Simpson's life unraveled quietly and tragically. Though financially supported by Edward's estate and with a modest allowance arranged by the Queen, her health rapidly declined. By the late 1970s, she had developed advanced dementia and suffered numerous physical ailments, including multiple hip fractures that left her frail and bedridden. From 1980 onward, she lost the ability to speak. More troubling still was her vulnerability to exploitation. Her French lawyer, Suzanne Blum, who had been entrusted with power of attorney, increasingly isolated Wallis and used her legal authority to exercise financial and personal control. Many observers believed Blum was manipulating the Duchess in her final years, profiting from her declining state. Wallis's last years were marked not by the glamour of café society or the defiant love that once captured the world's attention, but by silence, decay, and solitude. She died in Paris on 24 April 1986 at the age of 89. True to the arc of their shared life, her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, and she was buried beside Edward, an ending to a saga that had begun with defiance, passed through infamy, and concluded ultimately in reconciliation. Their story, though marked by scandal and suspicion, endured, and in their burial side by side, it found the peace that had so long eluded them in life. 10. The fall of a king, Edward VIII, and the shadow he cast on a nation. He was born into a destiny shaped by centuries of tradition. Yet from the beginning, Edward VIII, known as the Prince of Wales, long before he wore the crown, was a man who strained against the gilded cage of monarchy. When he ascended to the throne in January 1936, he was not the image of a conventional British king. In his early 40s and still unmarried, Edward's charm, glamour, and status as a global celebrity had made him the most recognizable royal figure of his generation. But with that fame came notoriety. For years, he had cultivated a reputation for indulgence, moving through a glittering world of nightclubs, socialites, and secret affairs, many with married women. It was this very lifestyle, so removed from the austere dignity expected of a sovereign, that soon collided with the throne he inherited. At the center of the maelstrom stood one woman, Wallis Simpson, an American, already divorced once and seeking another divorce in order to marry the new king. Simpson became the lightning rod for a constitutional crisis that would shake the British monarchy to its core. By 1934, Edward was completely infatuated. Their relationship, widely whispered about in the corridors of power and splashed across the foreign press, quickly escalated into a national scandal. When Edward made it known that he intended to marry her, resistance from the government, the Church of England, and even the royal family hardened into a wall. Simpson's status as a twice-divorced woman with living ex-husbands was officially cited as the moral obstacle. Yet deeper political concerns were already swirling. Edward's casual attitude toward his constitutional duties, his controversial opinions, and his troubling lack of discretion. Some believe Wallis was simply the excuse that allowed powerful political forces to remove a king who, they feared, might endanger the very foundations of Britain's constitutional monarchy. Regardless of the true motive, the outcome was historic and irreversible. On 11 December 1936, after just 327 days on the throne, Edward abdicated, the first monarch in British history to do so voluntarily, and passed the crown to his younger brother, George VI. Had the story ended there, with a king sacrificing his crown for love, it might have been remembered as a romantic tragedy, a tale of a man undone by outdated social mores. But what followed would darken Edward's legacy beyond recognition. Less than a year after his abdication, in the autumn of 1937, Edward and Wallis embarked on a controversial tour of Nazi Germany, one that saw them warmly received by top officials of the Third Reich. They met with Hermann Göring, Joseph Goebbels, and even Adolf Hitler himself. Though such meetings were not entirely unusual for visiting dignitaries at the time, the tone and context of the visit were deeply unsettling. Edward appeared to sympathize with fascism, viewing it as a necessary counterweight to socialism. He was photographed giving Nazi salutes, visiting German factories, including arms plants, and touring a concentration camp whose true purpose was deliberately obscured. While the exact nature of Edward's political discussions in Germany remains unknown, crucial documents were later destroyed. The visit sparked widespread alarm. The suspicions only grew stronger in 1940 after Nazi Germany swept across Western Europe and occupied France, where Edward and Wallis were then living. According to multiple sources, the couple maintained contact with German agents during their flight from Paris and were even the focus of a failed Nazi plot, Operation Willy, that sought to kidnap Edward and reinstall him as king in the event of a successful German invasion of Britain. While definitive proof of treason remains elusive, it is undeniable that Edward opened himself to grave suspicion through his associations, his statements, and his conduct. Whether out of naivety, arrogance, or a genuine alignment with certain Nazi ideals, the man who once ruled an empire came to be seen by many as a potential collaborator, if not a traitor. Thus, the legacy of Edward VIII remains tangled in ambiguity. Part romantic figure, part political liability, and forever overshadowed by a series of decisions that placed personal desire above public responsibility.